I would like to remind you how Spitsbergen was discovered by Dutch seafarer in 1596. If you remember, 16th century, all seas were under control of Portugal and Spain, and for countries like Netherlands and England, it was very important to trade with China, India, but they had to pay lots of money to go through normal route. And that's why Netherlands organized expeditions to find a way through Northeast Passage to China. And 1596 expedition under leadership of Willem Barents, they discovered Spitsbergen by chance. So they were looking for Northeast Passage, and by chance they discovered Spitsbergen. And they stayed over winter in Novaya Zemlya archipelago, and like half of expedition died, including Willem Barents itself. But those who survived, they reported about huge population of whales living in Spitsbergen. And that's why first human activity was whaling. The first whaling ships started already in the very beginning of 17th century. So main parties were Netherlands and England. And during next 150 years, they killed almost whole population of bowhead whale. And that's why it's not that easy to have bowhead whale now in the Arctic. So they left in the middle of 18th century. And then the first so-called non-commercial expedition under leadership of Chichagov started. So science started in Spitsbergen in the middle of 18th century. Before it was just whaling and hunting. The first expedition was organized by very famous Russian scientist Mikhail Lomonosov, who was very famous, so-called father of Russian science. His sphere of science was not only geography but also literature, history, astronomy, chemistry, physics. He was a poet, and on top of that he was pomor. If you remember pomors, trappers and hunters from northwest Russia, they were active in Spitsbergen for at least for 2 centuries. And so his idea was to elevate polar research to national duty of Russia in 18th century. And he proposed to go to Bering Strait through North Pole. So it was original plan. Because even in 18th and 19th century, people believed so North Pole and Arctic Ocean is free of ice. Now we know it's not true, but even in 18th century, even in 19th century, scientists, they strongly believed so there is no ice close to North Pole. And that's why Lomonosov decided to organize that so-called secret expedition. 1764, he died himself just shortly before, and Admiral and expedition leader Chichagov was appointed to lead that expedition. They started in 1764. They used Spitsbergen as a base camp, so a really good starting point for North Pole voyages. So they organized a base camp in Belsund. Belsund is like central part of Spitsbergen here. So they built 16 houses, and 8 people stayed over winter. And next year they wanted to pick them up on the way to Spitsbergen, but ice conditions were really bad, and they couldn't come inside Belsund. They proceeded to North Pole. They reached 26 degrees north, and they went back to Arkhangelsk. Ice was really heavy. They couldn't go any further. And next year they managed to reach Belsund, but they found all the people dead. So and they decided to try another time. 1766, they reached a little bit further, 30, but they met impenetrable ice, and they went back to Russia. And on the way to North Pole, they did some research in Greenland Sea, some cartography, some mapping of west coast of Spitsbergen. So 3 ships were used, Chichagov, Panov, and Babaev. So even if it's not that successful, at least they did some research on the way to North Pole, which was very important for the 18th century. And this is a picture from 1970s of excavation of their wintering camp in Tomtoden. This is remains of their expedition base camp in 2000s. And lots of topographic names were named after Lomonosov itself in Spitsbergen, and this is ice cap Lomonosov, which is between Langerbyen and Pyramiden, order settlement in Spitsbergen. And if you want to visit Pyramiden in winter, you have to cross ice cap Lomonosov, and it's not that easy. So almost all winter is -30, -40, very windy. You need to have lots of layers of good equipment, and sometimes it works, sometimes not. So Lomonosov named after leader of that expedition, Lomonosov-Chichagov expedition, 1764-66. Second attempt to reach North Pole from Spitsbergen was made by Constantine John Phipps, 1773. If you remember, at the end of 18th century, England was trying to navigate Northwest Passage, but also they decided to have a look what's going on at North Pole. And so first British expedition started in 1773 under leadership of Constantine John Phipps, a Royal Navy officer. So they used to bomb vessels, racehorse and car cars. They were modified to be kind of icebreakers. So now it's considered as the Britain's first purpose-built icebreakers. But of course they weren't icebreakers like La Commandant Shelko, but still they tried. What do you think? Did they reach North Pole or not? Of course not. So they left England in early June 1773. They reached Northwest Spitsbergen by the end of June the same year. Then they tried Northwest. They met ice. They turned back. They went along north coast of Spitsbergen. Tried another time to go north, again impenetrable ice, and then they reached undiscovered group of islands, which now we call it Shoyaine, seven islands archipelago. It's north of Spitsbergen. So they climbed the top of the hill, and they realized saw ice all the way around, towards the north, towards the east, and at the same time they were blocked by ice. And they decided already to abandon ships, but finally, on their luck, suddenly ice just gone a little bit, and they immediately moved back to northwest corner of Spitsbergen, and then they proceeded to England. So, of course, they didn't reach North Pole, but in England it was considered as success. The first expedition, they did a scientific description of polar bear and ivory gull. And on board one of the ship was very famous Horatio Nelson, who later became very famous naval officer of England. So it's like engraving how he's communicating with polar bear. 1773. So this is the islands they reached, 7 islands archipelago, and they were stopped by the ice. So now we have Phippsoya, island named after John Constantine Phipps, and actually it's very ill-fated island, one of the northernmost island of Spitsbergen archipelago. And there is very bad story happened in Fipsoya in 2019. German ship decided to have a landing on Fipsoya. They sent expedition staff, they didn't check, they didn't scout it properly, and then suddenly there was a polar bear. And that polar bear caught one of the expedition guides and started playing with them, like this, and then expedition leader shot polar bear. Yeah, so that's why it's very important to scout properly any landing sites, because you never know. You can have polar bear at anywhere, anytime. Yeah, Fipsoya. Next attempt to reach North Pole. What do you think? Did they reach or not? No. Of course not. 1827, Sir William Edward Parry, another British officer, admiral, and Arctic explorer. Before he tried North Pole, he participated at least in 4 expeditions to Northwest Passage. And the first Northwest Passage expedition was under leadership of John Ross, and that expedition discovered new group of Inuits, and that Inuits never seen white people before. And next year's other expedition tried to find them, but no more. So then 3 more Northwest Passage expeditions. They were not successful, but William Parry at his time was the most experienced Arctic explorer, and he decided to organize another expedition to North Pole in 1827. So he decided to use his ship Hekla, which he used before in Northwest Passage. On board of Hekla, he took 2 small boats, Enterprise and Endeavour, and they were designed as sledges. So original plan was proposed actually by John Franklin, and idea was to reach the north of Spitsbergen and then use that small boats to go to North Pole. And they decided to use reindeers as draft animals. And that reindeers they picked up on the way to Spitsbergen in Hammerfest in Norway. And as soon as they reached the very north of Spitsbergen, Trøndeberg Bay, which later was used by another very famous expedition, Swedish and Russian Arctic Meridian expedition, at the very end of 19th century. So they anchored the Hekla. They 5 people stayed on board. They did some research east coast of Spitsbergen, and the rest of crew, 22, 11 on each boat, they went north. As soon as they reached the same islands, 7-island archipelago, they realized reindeers are useless. And ice is not that flat. You remember, ice is not flat. Lots of hummocks, ridges, Polonia, open water, and they just left reindeers in Fipsoya again. And they started firstly rowing, then when they met ice, they started to pulling their boats. It wasn't easy, and it took 1 month for them to realize it's impossible to reach Spitsbergen. So it's impossible to reach North Pole working as reindeers, because strong currents permanently moving them southward. But they reached 80 to 45. It was a record at that time, and that record was remained unbeaten for 50 years. So they, at least they set up a record. They turned back, so the expedition went really hard. Actually, William Edward Parry proposed very original plan. So they traveled by night and they rested by daytime, because temperature at daytime a little bit more comfortable, and during the night it's easy to go through the ice because a little bit lower temperature. Anyway, they so their progress was just 170 miles. They turned back, they reached the northern Trøndelag Bay, which is here, and they decided to went back to England. In England, it was also considered as a success, even though they didn't reach North Pole, but at least they set up a record 82:45, which was unbeaten till 1872. It's not about North Pole expedition, it's just about French expedition, because we were on board French ship. So in 1840, France decided to organize the first expedition towards North Pole. It took 2 years. The crew on board was scientists from France, European countries, and as well as of Scandinavia. They visited Iceland, Faroe Islands, northern Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and even northwest Russia. And in 1839, they reached Spitsbergen. They did some scientific works. They did some research of topography, glaciology, biology, aurora borealis, and Earth magnetism. Not so much information available about that expedition, maybe only in French, of course, but look at the engravings, really beautiful. And actually that ship, which was called La Recherche, if I'm good in French, La Recherche. La Recherche, thank you very much. And there was first a lady who stepped on Spitsbergen land was Lenny de Annette. I hope I'm okay in French name. Lenny de Annette. De Annette. Okay, so they brought first woman in history of Spitsbergen, which managed to step on Spitsbergen land. And look at the engravings, it's just amazing. In the second half of 19th century, Sweden became a driving force of science and exploration expeditions in Spitsbergen. And most of expeditions was under leadership of this guy, Nils Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld. He was born in Helsinki when Finland was part of Russia, and he did lots of criticism of Tsar regime, and that's why he became political refugee. He moved to Sweden and started his scientific and explorer career. The first time he visited Spitsbergen in 1864, and next year he published a Spitsbergen map, which was very, very accurate and was in use till the very end of 19th century. In 1868, he decided to try steamship Sophia to reach North Pole from Spitsbergen. What do you think he did or not? Of course not. They reached 82:42, even a bit lower than Paddy. And so he just did the same conclusion. It's impossible to use ships to reach North Pole from Spitsbergen because heavy ice and direction of currents all permanently moving you southward. So it was impossible, of course. Now it's possible, but at the end of 19th century it wasn't possible. Next attempt made by Nordenskjöld was in 1872-73. So he was on board steamer Polhem. They used North Spitsbergen, very north of Spitsbergen. They anchored in Trøndelag Bay again, but that autumn was really heavy ice conditions, and 6 other sailing ships were frozen nearby, and they asked him to stay in his base camp, but he didn't have so much food. But he couldn't say no. He sent like half of their crew to his house in Isfjorden, which was called Svensk Huset, Swedish house, and that 17 sailors stayed overnight in that house, and next year all of them were found dead. And before we thought it's just scurvy, because scurvy was the main cause of death back in days. But recent research, like 15 years ago, showed so it was poison, like lead poisoning. So they poisoned with lead. So they had canned food, and that lead came into food. It was sealed not properly. So yeah, he tried. Next winter he wanted to try also reindeers, but local reindeers, not from Scandinavia. And that reindeers just disappeared shortly before his expedition. He even didn't start. He decided to explore Nordauslandet, which is second largest island of Spitsbergen archipelago after West Spitsbergen. And he was the first who did research in Nordauslandet, and later he became very world famous because he was the first who managed to navigate Northeast Passage, 1878-79, on board his small ship Vega. Yeah, he didn't reach North Pole, but at least he was first who managed Northeast Passage. This is how Svensk Huset looks nowadays. Actually, this is the oldest house standing now in Spitsbergen, in Isfjord, not far from Pyramid. Yeah, this is picture of his, not picture, engraving of his ship Vega. And in Spitsbergen you have lots of topographic names named after Niels Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld. And my favorite glacier, Nordenskjöld Bren, named after him. So this is a picture of Nordenskjöld Bren. And sometimes it's really nice to have a whiskey with ice from Nordenskjöld Glacier. Next expedition was made by Swedish engineer August Solomon André. Actually, the first time when he visited Spitsbergen, and he stayed overnight during first international polar year, and he stayed overnight in that house, Svensk Huset, which was built by Niels Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld. So Sweden was very important country in Spitsbergen in the second half of 19th century, and if you remember, that time Norway was part of Sweden. Norway got its independence just in 1905. So he tried air balloon. What do you think? Did he reach? No. So he brought air balloon Örnen. Örnen means eagle from Swedish. With the very northwest corner of Spitsbergen, Virgo Hamna. So now it's called Virgo Hamna, named after his ship Virgo, but before it was Pikes Bay. So they brought air balloon built in Paris. They even didn't test it before. July 1897, this is the last picture of that air balloon. So their flight just lasted 2 days. In 2 days they just crash landed on the ice somewhere northeast of Spitsbergen. They reached 83 degrees north, and then it took 3 months to cross the ice. And 6th of October they reached Kvitoya. Kvitoya means white island. Why it's white? Because 99% of Kvitoya is covered by huge ice cap, 700 square kilometers. There are also just 2 possible landing sites, very west and very east. They reached Kvitoya just before polar night started. So, and they died in 2 weeks because they shot polar bear and they poisoned with polar bear meat. There was trichinosis or something like that. So, but their camp was found just in 1930 by chance by Norwegian sealing ship Brodvak. And during 33 years, nobody knew about that expedition. They just disappeared in 1897 and they were found in 33 years later. And they got a state funeral in Sweden, so there were three, August Salomon Andre, Knut Frenkel, meteorologist, and another engineer, Nils Strindberg. So this is actually, they had a camera, and in 1930 there was also film was found, and it was still okay to develop because climate, cold and dry. And now we can see that like last pictures from that ill-fated expedition to North Pole. So actually this is that polar bear meat of which they were poisoned. This is the funeral of funeral of the members of that expedition in Stockholm. And this is Kvitoja and me at the Andreneset, Cape Andreneset, named after August Salomon Andre, and monument of that expedition last summer. Another attempt, the same day, Virgo Hamna. So this American businessman, Walter Wellman, tried 3 times to reach North Pole. What do you think? Did he reach or not? No. Before he tried Franz Josef Land with sledges and sheep. He didn't. And then he decided to try northwest corner of Spitsbergen, Virgo Hamna. And now we call Virgo Hamna as Arctic Cape Canaveral, because very famous expedition started from Virgo Hamna. He tried 3 times and it wasn't successful at all. So he tried with airship America, and the first attempt was just bad weather. He abandoned it. Next year he came back, and that airplane just crashed like after 3 hours of flight. And another attempt in 1909, he crashed just a little bit further. All of them failed.
Why did they fail? We know why.
Because not wind, because the engine didn't work properly. Power wasn't enough to, for propeller. So yeah. And finally, 1926, airship Norge, very famous expedition. So this is the first time when people reached North Pole by air. So a leader was very famous Norwegian polar explorer Roald Amundsen. So he was the first who managed to navigate Northwest Passage in 1903-1905 on board his boat Goya. Then he was the first who reached South Pole in 1911. And then he decided to go to North Pole. Why not? So in 1926, Roald Amundsen, his sponsor from the States, Lincoln Ellsworth, who contributed $100,000, which was a lot in 1926. And constructor, engineer of this dirigible, of this airship, was Italian engineer Umberto Nobile. So 3 of them were on board, plus 12 crew. So they started 11th of May in New Allison, which was Kings Bay in 1920s. Probably we're gonna visit New Allison during our Spitsbergen part of our North Pole trip, and you will see historical mast. So they started from New Allison. They flew over North Pole. They didn't land. They just flew over and they dropped flags on the North Pole. First it was, of course, American, because it was American money, then Norwegian, and then Italian. and they landed in Alaska. So their trans-Arctic flight took 3 days. So everything went perfectly. They landed in Alaska. Yeah, so this is Roald Amundsen, Lincoln Ellsworth, and Umberto Nobile. And then, as soon as they landed, the big argument between Umberto Nobile and Roald Amundsen started. Who is the boss? And who was Umberto Nobile? No one knew about him, but Roald Amundsen was already world famous guy. So when Umberto Nobile came back to Italy, it was already Benito Mussolini with power, and he wasn't happy with that, and they decided to organize only Italian expedition 2 years later. So this is the historical must in New Lisbon. And in 1928, Umberto Nobile brought his another ship, Italia. They started, I have a video. They started in May 1928. 15 people were on board. They reached North Pole without any problems, but on the way back, they decided to discover undiscovered islands or land. Of course, they didn't, but they crash landed on the ice, and 5 of crew with part of gondola just flew away, and the rest 9, they set up a tent. They painted in red, and they managed to send a sauce, and that sauce was received by amateur radio guy in Soviet Union. That guy reported to Soviet government, and Soviet government organized icebreaker crossing to find the camp, because they already knew where to find. And altogether, more than 1,500 people were involved in that huge search and rescue expedition. More than 15 ships and more than 20 aircrafts were involved. So it was huge. And finally, they were found and rescued by Soviet icebreaker crossing in July 1928. So you can see footage from preparation of that expedition. Started from Kings Bay or New Lisbon in 1928. So it was May, and you can see how May in 1920s was much colder, more snow. Yeah, the climate was much colder even 90 years ago. So this is the picture of icebreaker crossing, which managed to rescue all survivors of Umberto Nobile expedition in 1928. And actually, if you're interested in to know more details about that expedition, there is very interesting movie, Red Tent, Soviet-Italian movie, 1969 with Sean Connery. Highly recommend. Yeah, crossing, and this is so-called Graffiti Beach. All expeditions, very important expedition in the very end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century, they visited that so-called Graffiti Beach in Nordhauslandet and left some signatures. So this is signature of that icebreaker crossing. USSR, Red Bear crossing, 1928. So Red Bear was name of small airship on board that icebreaker. And yeah, this is that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, yeah. So if you remember, we are 166 ship which we reached North Pole. And now you know. So, but first expedition started from Spitsbergen. It wasn't easy, and all of them failed. And so now it's really easy to reach North Pole by icebreakers, but even 90 years ago it was really complicated. Lots of people died on the way to North Pole, yeah, many ships drowned, many ships were damaged, but La Commandant Charcot is the best